History often forgets one brutal detail. Weeks after Dunkirk, Britain attacked the French Navy at Mers-el-Kébir. How did the resistance survive this betrayal by their only ally? This single act of violence, committed by an ally against a defeated friend, would become a poison in the bloodstream of Franco-British relations and a terrible, almost insurmountable obstacle for the very men and women who were just beginning to whisper the word resistance. To understand the depth of this wound and how it was inflicted, we must first return to the days of total collapse. We must understand the desperation, the abandonment, and the political vacuum that set the stage for one of the most painful and tragic decisions of the Second World War. June 4, 1940. The final boats were pulling away from the mole at Dunkirk. Behind them, the beaches were a graveyard of a defeated army. 338,000 Allied soldiers had been rescued, pulled from the shore in a desperate 9-day miracle. But this miracle had a catastrophic price. They had escaped, but they had left everything behind. Every tank, every artillery piece, every truck, every rifle they had brought to France was now sinking into the sand or burning in massive pyres, left for the advancing Wehrmacht. The British Expeditionary Force was safe, for the moment, on its island, but it was an army with no weapons. It had abandoned an army's worth of equipment on French soil. In Paris, the news was received not with relief, but with a cold, creeping dread. People read the newspapers, listening to the strained broadcasts, and they understood exactly what this meant. The British were going home. The sea was now between them, and France was alone. In the corridors of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, a 22-year-old art historian named Agnès Humbert walked through streets that suddenly felt hollow, haunted. The rumble of the front, once a distant abstraction, was now a terrifyingly close, advancing thunder. The government, the entire apparatus of the Third Republic, was already packing its bags, talking openly of moving south, away from the inevitable German advance. Her colleagues at the museum, intellectuals and academics, no longer spoke of victory. They spoke in hushed, fearful whispers about what would come next. Some said Britain would be forced to negotiate, that this new prime minister, Churchill, would finally see reason, that the war was, for all intents and purposes, over. France had fought. France had bled, losing tens of thousands of men in a matter of weeks, and now it was finished. But in the cafes, in the apartments, in the museums and universities, not everyone was whispering about surrender. A different kind of person, a different kind of patriot, was asking a different, more dangerous question, a question that would soon define their lives, or end them. What happens if Britain doesn't stop? The German advance that followed Dunkirk was not a battle. It was a dissection. It came like a scythe through wheat. In just 6 weeks, the French army, the mighty force that had held the German Empire for 4 agonizing years in the last war, completely and utterly collapsed. It was not because the French soldier refused to fight. They fought with desperate courage. 90,000 of them died in those 6 weeks trying to hold back the tide. But this was a new kind of war, a war for which they were fatally unprepared. The German panzers, operating in terrifying, coordinated spearheads, moved too fast. The Luftwaffe, the most modern air force in the world, controlled the skies. acting as flying artillery, spreading terror among soldiers and civilians alike. The French command structure, a relic built for the static, trench-based warfare of 1914, simply could not adapt. It issued orders to divisions that no longer existed, to lines that had been overrun days before. The entire system broke down, not just militarily, but psychologically. By mid-June, German tanks were only 50 miles from Paris. The government declared it an open city, a gesture to spare it from destruction, but a gesture that signaled total surrender. And on the roads heading south, the greatest refugee crisis in modern European history was unfolding. 6 million French civilians, a tenth of the entire population, fled their homes. They carried what they could. They walked. They pushed bicycles and wooden carts. They carried children in suitcases, the elderly in wheelbarrows. And from the skies, the German planes descended. The Stukas strafed the refugee columns, their sirens wailing. There was no military purpose to this. It was pure, calculated terror. People died in ditches, on roadsides, in fields, their meager belongings scattered around them. The government, now in total disarray, fled to Bordeaux, clinging to the coast as if the sea itself might offer an escape. The army was shattered, ceasing to exist as a coherent fighting force. And in Paris, on June 14th, Agnes Humbert stood and watched as German motorcycles, the vanguard of the occupation, rolled triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées. The swastika flag was hoisted over the Arc de Triomphe. That night she wrote in her diary, her hand shaking. But, as she noted, it was not from fear, though the fear was a cold stone in her stomach. It was from rage, a profound, suffocating rage. She wrote of a feeling that something fundamental had broken, that the world she had known had just ended, and she had no idea what or who would come next. The political end came swiftly. 2 days later, on June 16th, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who had pleaded with the Americans for help and the British for support, resigned. He had wanted to keep fighting. He had a desperate, ambitious plan: move the government to North Africa, to Algiers, and continue the war from the vast French colonies, using the power of the still intact French Navy. But his cabinet, exhausted, defeated, and terrified, would not support him. His place was taken by a ghost from the past, Marshal Philippe Pétain, 84 years old, the hero of Verdun, the savior of France in 1916. He was a symbol of French resilience. But in 1940, he had become a symbol of defeat. The very first thing Pétain did as the new head of state was ask Germany for an armistice. He was asking for terms of surrender. In London, the news was received with disbelief and horror. A 49-year-old French brigadier general named Charles de Gaulle heard the broadcast. He was a junior general, barely known to the public, a vocal proponent of armored warfare who had been ignored by his superiors. Reynaud, in a last-ditch effort, had appointed him Under-Secretary of State for War just days before. De Gaulle had been in London, negotiating with Churchill about continued cooperation, about moving French forces to Britain, about anything but surrender. Now his government was capitulating, his superiors were surrendering. He was a general with no army, a minister of a government that was ceasing to exist. He had a choice to make. He could board a plane, return to France, and accept the fate of his nation, becoming a prisoner of war or a servant of the new regime. Or he could stay. He could defy his government, his military superiors, and his nation's chosen leader. He could choose treason. Winston Churchill had already made his choice clear. On June 4th, standing before Parliament in the immediate aftermath of Dunkirk, he had delivered a speech that would define the very concept of defiance. His voice, that particular rolling, thunderous cadence, made words feel like weapons. "We shall go on to the end," he roared. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." In France, those who heard reports of this speech had sharply different reactions. To the new government in Bordeaux, to Marshal Pétain, these were the words of a madman. Britain was an island, yes, but its army was shattered. Its equipment was at the bottom of the sea or rusting on the beaches of Dunkirk. How could Britain possibly fight alone? It was delusional. But others heard something else in those words. In Paris, Agnès Humbert heard them. So did a literature professor named Jean Cassou. So did a brilliant museum ethnographer named Boris Vildé. They did not hear madness, they heard defiance. They heard the sound of someone, somewhere, refusing to accept that the war was over. On June 17th, the day after taking power, Marshal Pétain addressed the French nation by radio. His voice was the opposite of Churchill's. It was old, tired, paternal, the voice of a grandfather comforting a weeping child. "It is with a heavy heart," he said, "that I tell you today that we must cease fighting." He called it necessary. He called it honorable. He said he was making a gift of his person to France, to absorb her suffering in her hour of need. He was wrapping surrender in the flag of sacrifice. Agnès Humbert listened to that broadcast in her apartment. She felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This wasn't an armistice. This was a complete and total surrender. This was the end of France as she had known it. And Pétain spoke as if it was noble, as if giving up was a final, tragic act of patriotism. She thought about Britain. She thought about Churchill's speech. She thought about the simple, earth-shattering fact that just across the narrow English Channel, someone was still saying no. The very next day, June 18th, Charles de Gaulle stood in a small BBC studio in London. He had made his choice. He had refused to return to France. He had refused to accept the armistice. He was, in the eyes of the new French government, a deserter and a traitor. Now he was going to speak to his countrymen from exile, using his allies' radio, and tell them that Pétain was wrong, that France had not lost the war, it had only lost a battle. His voice was stiff, formal, unused to broadcasting. He was a career military officer, not a politician. But the words were clear, precise, and absolute. The flame of French resistance, he declared, must not and shall not die. Whatever happens, he told them, the flame of French resistance must not go out. Almost nobody in France heard that broadcast. The BBC was not widely listened to yet. German jamming was already beginning. De Gaulle was a junior general, a nobody. His speech should have vanished into the static, a footnote of a forgotten man. But it didn't, because over the next few days and weeks the word spread. Someone heard it and told someone else. Someone wrote the words down. Someone printed them on a clandestine leaflet. And people in France, people who felt that same cold rage that Agnès Humbert felt, people who felt choked by Pétain's honorable surrender, started to realize they weren't alone. In Paris, at the Musée de l'Homme, Agnès Humbert, Boris Vildé and their colleagues began meeting in secret. They weren't soldiers. They were intellectuals, academics, librarians, ethnographers. They had no weapons, no training, but they had a powerful sense of defiance. They started producing a clandestine newspaper, written by hand, typed on hoarded typewriters, and secretly distributed. They called it, simply, Resistance. In its pages, they wrote articles arguing that France was not defeated, that the war would continue, that Britain's refusal to surrender meant that hope still existed. They looked to London, not just to the obscure General de Gaulle, but to the simple, stubborn fact that Britain was still fighting, that Churchill had said no, that somewhere, someone was still resisting. Boris Vildé, a Russian-born scholar who had become French by choice and loved his adopted country fiercely, put it simply in one of their first meetings. His hands moved as he spoke, sketching ideas in the air. Pétain says the war is over. Churchill says it continues. We choose Churchill. It was a clear, simple, and heroic choice. But just as this first, fragile spark of resistance was lit, that same Churchill, the man who had become their symbol of hope, was about to make a decision so brutal, so shocking, that it would nearly extinguish that flame forever. He was about to give the order to open fire on the French Navy. The date was July 3, 1940, less than 3 weeks after de Gaulle's appeal. At the vast, sun-baked French naval base of Mers-el-Kébir in Algeria, the most powerful elements of the French fleet lay at anchor. The ships included the old but powerful battleships Bretagne and Provence, and the new, fast, state-of-the-art battlecruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg. For the British War Cabinet, this fleet was a nightmare. It was one of the most powerful in the world. The armistice Pétain had signed was ambiguous. It stated the fleet would be collected in ports to be specified, and there demobilized and disarmed under German or Italian control. The Germans and Italians swore they would not use the ships for their own purposes. Churchill did not believe them for a second. The idea of these magnificent, powerful ships falling into Hitler's hands was unthinkable. If the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, were to add this fleet to its own, it could tip the balance in the Atlantic. Britain's survival depended on its transatlantic lifeline. That lifeline could be cut. Churchill and his cabinet made a cold, pragmatic, and terrible calculation. The French fleet had to be neutralized, by any means necessary. They called it Operation Catapult. A British squadron, Force H, arrived off the coast under the command of Admiral James Somerville. He had an ultimatum for the French commander, Admiral Marcel Gensoul. Gensoul had 4 choices. 1. Sail with the British and continue to fight. 2. Sail to a British port where the crews would be repatriated. 3. Sail to a French port in the West Indies where the ships would be demilitarized. 4. Scuttle the ships, sink them at their moorings within 6 hours. If Gensoul refused all 4 options, Somerville had his 5th and final order: destroy the French fleet. Admiral Gensoul was a proud man, bound by his oath to Petain's new government. He felt the ultimatum was a profound insult to his honor. He refused to be coerced. He stalled for time, believing he could negotiate. He was wrong. At 5:54 p.m., after a day of tense, failed negotiations, the British fleet opened fire. The attack, which the French would come to call an odious tragedy, lasted only 15 minutes, but it was 15 minutes of hell. The British 15-inch shells, fired from the battleships Hood, Valiant, and Resolution, rained down on the anchored, trapped French vessels. The greatest loss of life occurred almost instantly. The battleship Bretagne, struck by the third British salvo, was torn apart by a massive explosion. The shells found her magazines. The ship capsized and sank in minutes, taking 977 of her crew to their deaths. Other sources would place the total at 997. The battlecruiser Dunkirk, Gonsul's flagship, was severely damaged and run aground, her guns silenced. The battleship Provence was also hit, set ablaze and beached. The destroyer Mogador had her stern blown off. Only the battlecruiser Strasbourg and a few destroyers managed to escape the harbor in the chaos, slipping past the British submarines and racing for the open sea. In the aftermath, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. The final death toll was staggering. 1,297 French naval personnel were killed. Some sources list 1,300. Over 350 more were wounded. In 15 minutes, Britain had killed more Frenchmen than the Germans had in the first month of the war. The Dunkirk was not yet finished. Believing it was still a threat, the British returned on July 8th, launching torpedoes from Swordfish aircraft, causing further explosions and killing more of her skeleton crew. The final toll on the Dunkirk alone would be 210 men. For the fledgling resistance in France, the news was a psychological catastrophe. Their beacon of hope, London, had just massacred their countrymen. In London, General de Gaulle was plunged into pain and anger. He and his small, fledgling organization had been purposefully kept in the dark by Churchill. They had not been warned. Vice Admiral Émile Muselier, the commander of the tiny, nascent Free French naval forces, was dejected. He met with de Gaulle the day after the attack, and both men considered the unthinkable. They considered breaking with their British ally. They discussed relocating to a colony beyond Vichy's reach, perhaps Pondicherry in India. De Gaulle himself, profoundly disheartened, later admitted he was so depressed about the long-term effects that he thought he might give up the struggle entirely and retire to private life in Canada. The Free French movement was nearly strangled at birth. But de Gaulle quickly recovered. He concluded, in a moment of agonizing clarity, that the saving of France ranked above everything. It ranked above the fate of her ships, and even above the lives of her sailors. His duty was to continue the A. On July 8th, he once again stood before a BBC microphone, this time to perform one of the most difficult feats of intellectual gymnastics of his life. He had to justify the unjustifiable to his own people. He addressed the French, acknowledging the odious tragedy. He grieved for the sailors, but then he pivoted. He placed the blame squarely on Pétain's dishonorable engagement. And then he said the words that would haunt him, but which he believed were necessary. I say unhesitatingly that it is better that they should have been destroyed. He famously used the Dunkirk as his example. I prefer to know that the Dunkirk, our fine, powerful, and beloved Dunkirk, is beached at Mers-el-Kébir than to see her one day manned by Germans bombarding the English ports, or even Alger, Casablanca, or Dakar. He was arguing the lesser of two evils. But for millions in France, this speech was not a justification. It was a confession. The Vichy government, led by Pétain, seized upon the incident with ruthless efficiency. Mers-el-Kébir was not a tragedy, their propaganda machine declared. It was a premeditated act of British aggression. and de Gaulle, by defending it, was their accomplice. Vichy immediately framed the incident as a barbaric atrocity. They published the casualty lists. They ensured the French public was constantly reminded of the human cost. A film showing the cemetery at Mers-el-Kébir, with its rows upon rows of over 1,200 graves and crosses, was frequently shown on screens in France. A national memorial service was held for the martyrs. This propaganda was devastatingly effective. It branded de Gaulle and the nascent resistors as traitors allied with killers. Vichy newspapers and radio broadcasts launched a new, intense anti-de Gaulle campaign. He was nakedly a British tool, an anti-France, a British assassin. Marshal Pétain himself referred to the resistance as mercenary treason and British aggression. The public, especially in the unoccupied South, turned virulently anti-British. This Anglophobia was a powerful weapon. A French columnist wrote that England was ill-advised, or perhaps badly advised, by the French in London. De Gaulle's own speech seemed to confirm this. It solidified the opinion that de Gaulle himself had had a hand in Operation Catapult. The effect on the Free French movement was immediate and catastrophic. Recruitment, which had already been a trickle, soon dried up after the Mers-el-Kébir affair. The numbers were stark. By June 1940, an estimated 18,000 French sailors and 500 naval officers were in England, having evacuated from Dunkirk and other ports. After Mers-el-Kébir and the subsequent British seizure of French ships in British ports, only 200 sailors and 50 naval officers chose to stay with de Gaulle. Many others, disgusted, chose to enlist directly with the British Navy rather than join the dissident and dishonored ex-general. Historian Aidan Crawley would later suggest that the tragedy was a blow which nearly put an end to the whole of the Free French movement. This was the new reality for the resistors back in France. For Agnes Humbert, Boris Wilde, and Jean Cassou, their work had just become infinitely more dangerous. Not only were they fighting the German occupiers, they were now fighting the narrative of their own government, a narrative that had just been handed its single most powerful piece of evidence. They were now, in the eyes of many of their countrymen, agents of a foreign power that murdered French sailors. Their choice to believe in Churchill was no longer a simple act of hopeful defiance. It was a complex, agonizing decision to look past the bodies of 1,300 of their own servicemen and hold on to a larger, more abstract principle. The armistice was formally signed on June 22, 1940. Hitler, in a perfectly staged act of humiliation, insisted the ceremony take place in the exact same railway car in the forest of Compiègne where Germany had surrendered in 1918. He had the car dragged from a museum for the occasion. The armistice divided France in two. The north, including Paris, was placed under direct German military occupation. The South and the colonies would be governed by Petain's regime from the spa town of Vichy. It was technically unoccupied, but it was a puppet state, actively collaborating with Germany. For most French people, the summer of 1940 was not about resistance. It was about survival. It was about finding food, avoiding German patrols, and trying to comprehend what life would be like now. Resistance was not a mass movement. It was a scattered collection of individuals, small, isolated groups of people, who simply could not, would not accept what had happened. And for these few, Britain's decision to fight on, despite the complication of Mers-el-Kébir, remained the essential difference between despair and hope. They had to make a conscious choice. What was the true symbol of Britain? The guns of Operation Catapult or the voice of Winston Churchill. Jean Cassou, the literature professor, wrote in his diary about the act of listening to the BBC. It was a lifeline. People gathered in secret to listen, risking arrest if caught. The Germans had ordered radios turned in, but many people hid them. Night after night, they would tune to London, to the BBC French service, just to hear that the war wasn't over. Cassou wrote about Churchill's voice cutting through the static. He speaks, Cassou wrote, as if defeat is impossible, as if the very idea of surrender is incomprehensible. And hearing that, I remember that it is incomprehensible, that we forgot something essential about ourselves, and he is reminding us. The broadcasts were more than military news. They were reminders that resistance was possible, that France hadn't ceased to exist just because Pétain had surrendered, that across the Channel someone still believed. In the southern Free Zone, people watched Pétain's government embrace collaboration. The Vichy regime promoted its national revolution, a deeply conservative, anti-Semitic, and authoritarian ideology. They put up posters with Pétain's grandfatherly face and the new slogan, "Work, Family, Fatherland," replacing the old "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." But in the cities of Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse, small groups began to organize. A communist cell here, a Catholic resistance network there, socialist activists, former military officers who refused to accept defeat. They had different politics, different backgrounds, but they shared one unifying belief: the war was not over. And they all, despite Mers-el-Kébir, looked to Britain. Lucy Aubrac, a young history teacher in Lyon, listened to the BBC with her husband Raymond. They heard Churchill's speeches, they heard de Gaulle's appeals, and in July, August, and September, they heard the news of a new great battle beginning, the Battle of Britain. German planes were attacking the island, trying to force the surrender that Pétain had so willingly given, and Britain was fighting back. Every night they don't surrender, Lucy said to Raymond, is a night that proves Pétain was wrong. She was 28 years old, teaching history to teenagers who were now being told that France's defeat was inevitable, that collaboration was wisdom. And every night the BBC told her and them a different story. The Battle of Britain became a powerful symbol, a counter-narrative to the shame of Mers-el-Kébir. In September 1940, when the German bombers filled the skies over London, when the Luftwaffe tried to break British will through the sheer terror of the Blitz, the French resistors listened to the reports. They heard about the RAF fighting back, about British civilians enduring the bombing, about Churchill's government refusing every hint of negotiation. Agnes Humbert wrote about it in her diary, contrasting the two capitals. London burns, she wrote, and does not surrender. Paris surrendered without burning. What does that say about us? What does that say about them? It was not a simple, blind admiration. The trauma of July 3rd had ensured that. Many resistors felt a complex mix of emotions. Some felt shame that Britain was fighting while France had given up. Some felt anger at Britain for evacuating at Dunkirk and for the massacre at Mers-el-Kébir. Some felt abandoned. But underneath all of that was a single, cold, logical recognition. Britain's defiance made their own resistance meaningful. If Britain had negotiated after Dunkirk, if Churchill had accepted Hitler's peace offers, then the resistors in France, Humbert, Vilde, Cassou, Aubrac, would have been fighting for nothing. They would have been isolated idealists tilting at windmills. There would be no Allied power left in the world, no hope of liberation, no point to their struggle. They would be truly, completely alone. But Britain fought on, and that meant resistance wasn't futile. It meant there was still a war to win. By late 1940, the Musée de l'Homme network was in full operation. They produced their newspaper, Résistance. They began helping downed Allied soldiers escape. They gathered intelligence on German positions. And the Gestapo, now firmly established in Paris, was hunting them. They knew the risks. Several members grew nervous, talking about stopping, about the danger being too great. But Boris Vildé argued fiercely against it. The British didn't stop when it was dangerous, he said. They didn't stop when it was rational to stop. We don't stop either. Their defiance could not last. In December 1940, the Gestapo arrested the first members of the network. By February 1941, they had been betrayed by someone in their circle. The Gestapo swept in and arrested Agnes Humbert, Boris Vildé, and most of the others. Their fate was brutal. Agnes Humbert would spend the next 4 years in German prisons and labor camps. Boris Vildé, along with 6 other members of the network, was subjected to a show trial and executed by firing squad at Mont-Valérien in February 1942. The Musée de l'Homme network, the very first organized resistance group in Paris, was destroyed. But their newspaper had given the movement its name. Their example and their sacrifice had inspired others. By 1941, new networks were forming all across France. Some were communist, organized after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Some were Gaullist, loyal to the general in London. Some were independent, just groups of French men and women who refused to accept the occupation. And they were all, in different ways, following Britain's example. The example of saying no when surrender seemed inevitable. In September 1941, a man who would become the great unifier of the movement, Jean Moulin, fled France and made his way to London. He met with de Gaulle. He met with British intelligence, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. He told them about the scattered resistance networks in France, about their desperate need for coordination, for supplies, for weapons, for radios. And he told them something else. He told them that Britain's refusal to surrender, that simple, stubborn no, had been the psychological foundation of the entire French resistance. That without that example, without that proof that defiance was possible, the resistance might never have formed at all. It had been strong enough to survive even the profound shock of Mers-el-Kébir. Churchill's government, through the SOE, began dropping supplies into France. Weapons, explosives, radios, money. British and Free French agents parachuted in, risking capture and torture, to help organize the networks. The resistance grew from scattered, whispering groups into a genuine underground army. It had all started with people like Agnes Humbert, like Boris Vildé, like Jean Cassou, who heard Churchill say, "We shall never surrender," and thought, "Then neither shall we." The relationship was never simple. De Gaulle's relationship with Churchill was famously, spectacularly difficult. De Gaulle was prickly, proud, and fiercely insistent on French sovereignty and dignity. Churchill found him exasperating, once famously saying that the heaviest cross he had to bear was the Cross of Lorraine, de Gaulle's symbol. They had constant disputes about strategy, about politics, about France's role in the war. But for the resistors on the ground, hiding in cellars, printing leaflets, sabotaging railways, those political complications mattered far less than the fundamental fact. Britain was fighting. London was the beacon. The BBC was the voice that cut through the lies of Vichy propaganda and reminded them that resistance was possible. By 1942, the resistance was conducting major sabotage operations. By 1943, they were preparing for liberation, coordinating with Allied command. By 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy, the resistance rose up across France, cutting railways, ambushing German units, and liberating entire towns ahead of the Allied advance. Lucy Aubrac, who had listened to the BBC in Lyon, became a key resistance organizer, famous for her daring operations, including rescuing her husband Raymond from the Gestapo. After the liberation, she wrote about those early days, about hearing Churchill's speeches and feeling that resistance was possible. "We needed someone to show us that defeat could be refused," she wrote. "Pétain told us to accept. Churchill told Britain to fight, and we chose to believe Churchill." Agnes Humbert survived the camps. Barely. She was liberated by Soviet forces in April 1945, weighing only 78 pounds, her health destroyed. She returned to France and wrote her memoir, Résistance, about those early, desperate days at the Musée de l'Homme. She wrote about the moment she heard Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, about how it felt to know that someone, somewhere, was refusing to accept the world that Pétain was offering, about how that refusal gave her the courage to refuse as well. "They told us the war was over," she wrote. "Britain said it wasn't. We believed Britain, and we were right." The French resistance was not created by Britain's refusal to surrender. It was created by French people, by men and women who chose to resist, who risked everything, who fought and who died for their country's liberation. The courage was theirs. The sacrifice was theirs. But Britain's decision to fight on after Dunkirk, Churchill's speeches, the simple, undeniable fact that London kept broadcasting, kept fighting, kept saying no, this gave those resistors something essential. It gave them proof that resistance was possible. It gave them evidence that defiance was not futile. It gave them hope that they were not alone. In June 1940, when France fell, when Pétain surrendered, when German tanks rolled through Paris, the future looked impossibly dark. Most people thought the war was over, that Hitler had won, that the only question left was what terms Britain would accept. But Churchill said no. Britain fought on. And in France, people who could not accept surrender heard that no and thought, we can say that too. They paid terribly for it. The Gestapo arrested thousands. Many were tortured, executed, sent to camps. The resistance lost people like Boris Vildé, shot at Mont-Valérien, like Jean Moulin, tortured to death by Klaus Barbie, like countless others whose names we will never know, who died in cellars and camps and forests. But they won. France was liberated. The resistance played a crucial role in that liberation, sabotaging German forces, rising up when the Allies landed. And it all started with people who heard Britain refuse to surrender and decided they could refuse too. 75 years later, it is easy to forget how impossible it all looked in June 1940, how rational seemed, how insane continued resistance appeared. Britain was alone. Its army was defeated. Its cities were about to be bombed. Its survival was uncertain. The resistors in France were even more alone. They were in occupied territory, surrounded by German forces, hunted by the Gestapo. They had no army, no weapons, no support, just their conviction that surrender was unacceptable. And they looked to London, to Churchill's voice on the BBC, to the simple fact that Britain was still fighting. They looked past the smoke rising from their own fleet at Mers-el-Kébir, and held on to the smoke rising from the skies over London. They found the courage to fight, too. When Agnes Humbert was arrested, when the Gestapo interrogated her, they asked why she had done it, why she had risked everything for a futile cause. France had surrendered. Germany had won. Why couldn't she accept reality? She told them about listening to the BBC, about Churchill's speeches, about the fact that Britain hadn't accepted reality either. She told them she chose defiance over acceptance. They sent her to a labor camp. She survived. Britain survived. France was liberated. And the reality the Gestapo had offered turned out to be a lie. That is what the French resistance said when Britain wouldn't surrender after Dunkirk. They said if they can fight, so can we. If they can refuse, so can we. If they can believe victory is possible when it looks impossible, then so can we. They said we are not defeated. We are not done. We are not surrendering. They said the flame of French resistance will not go out. And it didn't.